Hi, Lindenwood class. It is time for more Echo Mountain. We're going to pick up with Chapter 35. Chapter 35. I wasn't the one to call out for my mother to see that Daddy had awakened. I was the one who went quietly to his bed, sat down on the edge of it, took his face in my hands, and cried the tears I'd been saving. Esther looked up from her book and must have thought he'd died. "Oh, no," she said at the sound of my sobbing. "Mother, come quick," which brought Samuel out from under the bed, pushing up alongside me to see what was going on. "Did you bring another snake, Ellie?" And then my mother arrived like a summer storm in time to see my father's eyes, still open. I didn't see her fall to her knees, though I heard her cry out. I didn't see Esther's face when she realized that our father had not died after all, that he had come back to us. But I felt her put her arms around me from behind, so she was holding both me and him too, and then my mother scrambled across the bed to kneel beside him, crying like a child, while Samuel said, "You're supposed to cry when you're sad, Mother." I slipped aside so Esther could cling to his arm, smiling and crying, and Samuel could climb onto the bed and bounce into the happy fray like a puppy. Through all of it, my father lay quietly. "He might need us to calm down a little," I said, sounding a lot older than I was. Esther turned to look at me, and I thought she'd be angry, but she wasn't. She let go of my father's arm, and she came to me all in a rush and hugged me like she hadn't hugged me since before the accident, back when she still loved me. "Oh, Ellie," she whispered, "you were right. You were right." But as I watched my father's slack face, I was afraid that my mother had been right too. He hadn't said a word, hadn't smiled, and there was no light in those open eyes. My mother pulled back from him, smiling, wiping the tears from her cheeks, and gave a long sigh. "You scared me," she said to him. "Ellie put a snake in your bed," Samuel said, and then my father closed his eyes and went to sleep again. My mother knelt on the bed, her hand in his, until her legs began to cramp, and then she scooted slowly away, careful not to wake him. I was amazed to see that, to see her try not to wake him. She beckoned for us to follow her from the room. "Go get Maisie and the puppies," she said softly. I didn't ask why. I knew why. "You better stay here," Samuel said to Esther. "Maisie is kind of nervous about the puppies." "There's jerky in the oven," my mother said to her. "Go turn it, and then fetch one of your father's work aprons and spread it next to him on the bed." For the puppies, I imagined, for the mess they might make. I was amazed again at such a thought in a moment like this, but my mother and Esther spent a lot of time trying to manage mess. I couldn't imagine what they'd say if they knew that I had, just the night before, scooped pus and maggots from an old woman's wound. "Come on, Ellie," Samuel said. "I'll help you get the puppies." Which he did, carrying two of them while I carried the other two, and Maisie danced alongside us, rising up on her hind legs to butt us with her nose, singing with confusion and worry as we took them all into the cabin and along to where my father lay sleeping again. I hoped that his sleep was just a simple sleep now. Maisie looked surprised when I urged her up onto the bed, but as soon as I put Quiet and his sister on the apron and added Samuel's pair, she jumped eagerly up, herding them with her nose into a bundle next to my father, and then circling 3-4 times before settling herself next to them. Without warning, she licked my father's face. He didn't move at all. "Good Maisie," I whispered to her. "Good Quiet. Good pups." I ran my hands over their neat little bodies, their perfect little coats, before leaving them all to their nap. Chapter 36. While the cabin sighed and settled toward noon, I sat at the kitchen table and poked new holes in my father's belt, now that he was so thin. Then I got up and went to the door of his room to see if he was awake. Then I used the tip of my knife to pry dried mud from the tread of his boots, and went back to see if he had wakened. After that I worked dubbin into my father's work gloves to make the leather soft again and ready for his hands. Then I went to see if he'd opened his eyes. "You're going to wear a track in the floor," my mother said. She had started a pot of venison stew with potatoes, carrots still sweet, and a tune she sang under her breath as she worked. I listened to that song with every kind of ear I had. Esther had gone to fetch some firewood, something I usually did, for which I was grateful, though I had not forgotten that standing guard over my father had been, just an hour earlier, her first purpose. That I had been, just an hour earlier, a threat. Samuel had joined me at the kitchen table and was drawing a picture of a black snake. "So I can show Daddy what was in his bed while he was sleeping." The snake looked about 3 times longer than the bed in the picture. It had a forked tongue and a wild eye. "Whatever happened to that snake?" I asked my mother as she diced a yellow turnip for the stew. She paused for a moment. "I would have put it in a soup. I would have chopped it up and put it in a soup, if I had caught it before it escaped down the drain." She turned to look at me, the knife poised in her hand. But I was glad I didn't kill it when I realized it could never have found its own way into your father's bed, with the door shut as it was. "Snake soup," Samuel muttered, his head low over his work. "That's silly, Mother." By now the snake in his picture had acquired a set of enormous fangs. "Nobody eats snake soup." "Maybe not, but if they have something better to eat," my mother said. "But some people don't, you know." I thought of Kate and Captain. "I'm going to show this to Daddy," Samuel said, hoisting the picture like a flag. "Don't you wake him up," my mother said. "He needs his rest." And I was amazed once again by the idea that she wanted him to sleep now that he had finally awakened. I wanted him up, on his feet, wearing that belt, those gloves and boots, a hat on his poor battered head, ready for what came next. "What will we do now?" I said. My mother gave me a puzzled look. "That's a broad question, Ellie. I mean, when he wakes again, will we get him up so he can walk?" "Oh, I don't think so. It's too soon for that," she sighed. "We have to be patient. It might take a long time for him to be well again, and he'll need all of us to help him. I know you'll do a lot of that work." She stirred the stew. "It's too bad you're not a boy, Ellie. You have all the makings of a fine doctor." It wasn't possible to live without a heart that could beat, but I still managed to stay right where I was, upright, when she said that. I'd never thought about being a doctor. That wasn't the word that had ever come to mind. But doing the work to wake my father and mend Kate had made me feel so very good that I wanted to be more like that girl. The one who tried to make people well. The one Kate needed to help her heal. To be the person she got better. To be the reason, she got better. Or one of the reasons. One would be enough. "I'm going back up the mountain to take care of Miss Kate," I said slowly. I remembered the last words my mother had said on that subject. "If I find out that you've been back up to see her, I don't know what I'll do." This time she spent a long moment before looking at me and saying, "I just told you that your father would need a lot of help, and you haven't had a lesson in days. You can't go without lessons, and Miss Kate taught Larkin to read, and she's already taught me how to heal a festering wound." "You didn't let me finish," my mother said. "If you had, I would have said that I'm surprised you would rather help a stranger than your own father, especially since you worked so hard to wake him up. And you want to leave? Now? When he's only just come back?" "But that's why I have to go," I said, learning the reason as I said it. "He's on his way home to us, and she's the one leaving. She's the one who needs help the most." But my mother just shook her head. "You confuse me, Ellie. Every time I turn around you're wearing a different face. One minute you're beating a path back and forth to your father's door, and now you want to go help a stranger when she already has that boy to help her." "She's not a stranger," I said, which had been true from the moment I laid eyes on her. "And even if she were, she'd be just as sick, and Larkin just as much one boy all alone with her." "None the less it's not safe for you to go up there, Ellie." She put a lid on the stew. "Not on your own?" "Then come with me, just to check on Miss Kate, just to make sure she's all right." She looked at me with wide eyes. "Do you honestly think I'm going to do that?" "But she's sick, Mother," Samuel said from the doorway. "One of the puppies peed on the apron." My mother gave me a last look, filled with disappointment. "That's what puppies do." She wiped her hands on a rag. "They don't know any better." When she followed him toward the bedroom, I did too. "Why can't he clean it up?" "Who? Samuel?" "Yes, Samuel. If a boy can be a doctor, why can't a boy clean up dog pee?" "I don't want to be a doctor," Samuel said. "Who said I wanted to be a doctor?" My father was still sleeping when we went into the room. One of the puppies had found his neck and was nesting against it. Another had draped itself over his arm. A third was licking his hand, its tongue a tiny pink petal. And Quiet, the dog who had started so much, was sound asleep on his chest. "Oh, well, that's a sight," my mother whispered, smiling. She folded the wet apron over on itself and gave it to me to take outside for washing. "Go get Esther," she said softly. "She should come see this." My father was still deeply asleep, his mouth parted, his arms limp at his sides. It would be hours, It could be hours before he woke again, and when he did, he would need me much less than he had before. I went outside. My sister was hanging laundry on the line, humming as she worked, her face happy. "Mother says to go on in and see the puppies with Daddy," I said. Esther looked up at me smiling as she pinned up the last of the wash, and then headed for the cabin, the empty basket swinging in her hand. I stood in the sun for a moment, thinking. "What am I supposed to do?" I said aloud, though I was alone. But the sky was busy being the sky, and the trees were busy being trees, and the birds likewise were being exactly who they were, which was in itself an answer. So I made up my mind to listen to the flame in my chest, which sighed and roared and sighed again like a long piece of music I knew by heart, but still seemed to be hearing afresh. I went into the woodshed to fetch my jacket, took the little wooden bee from the pocket and put it on the high shelf with the other gifts Larkin had given me. Then I took the jacket with the apron to wash under the well pump, wrung them out, and put the jacket back on, wet as it was. The cold was like a slap, but when the jacket dried it would take the shape of me, just so. Then I hung the apron on the line, went back into the cabin, filled a jar with venison stew, and stirred in some cold water from the pump so I could add a lid. Took it out to the woodshed and switched it for the jar of willow bark tea in my pack, and headed back up the mountain with plenty of daylight left. Chapter 37. Captain came to meet me at the steepest part of the path. "How is she?" I asked as I climbed toward him. He blinked in answer. He came forward to sniff my boots. It was the first time he'd come so close to me. When he looked up again, I read a bunch of questions in his eyes. "Yes, that's Puppy you smell. That's Quiet. When he's old enough, I'll bring him to meet you." But then I remembered once again that Quiet was meant for Mr. Anderson. Maybe I'll bring him up here to live. When I reached my hand out, palm up, Captain rested his soft jowl in it for just a moment, and then turned to lead the way to Kate's cabin. And I stood there on the path, ringing hard and loud with the feel of his face lingering on my hand, along with something more about loneliness and a sore heart and what a cabin feels like when the snow drifts so high around it that daylight is as thin and pale as way, and the only sound is the wind shearing across the mountain top, and the days are long and cold and hungry. "You are a wonderful dog," I said to him when he turned to look back at me. "You are a wonderful young man of a dog," which seemed to please him, though he didn't smile. When we got to the cabin I paused at the open door. Larkin was there, standing by her bed. Kate had said she wouldn't need me if he was there to look after her, but I hoped there was still some work for me as well. "Oh, Captain, my Captain," Kate said when she saw us there, "what have you brought me now?" I stepped inside. Larkin turned, and as my eyes adjusted to the light I saw that he was hurt. His left eye was swollen shut, the skin around it a mottled black and blue. "What happened?" I said, walking close to peer at his eye. The lid above bulged out balloon-like, and the skin below swelled to meet it, his lashes in between like little black teeth in a fat red mouth. "He got a black eye for coming up to see me," Kate said. Her voice was dark and bitter, but stronger than it had been, and there was some good color in her face. I reached toward his eye, but he stepped away. "I'm fine," he said, "and she's getting better." And I learned all over again, watching him, that it's possible to smile and look sad at the same time. "I am," Kate said. "Not well, but better." Larkin pulled the blanket down off her leg and untied the bandage so I could see for myself. The wound was still swollen. It was still dark and looked awful, but it wasn't nearly as angry as it had been. No pus and not much smell either, and there was a fine crust of blood and honey where Larkin had made his cut, though the seam began to ease open as I watched, and Larkin quickly tied the bandage snug again. We should stitch that closed," I said, though I had never done such a thing. "No," Kate said, "not yet. We might still need to open it up. The bandage will be enough for now." She pulled the blanket back over her leg. "I'll need your help to go outside," she said to me. "Not quite yet, but soon." She still hadn't said hello. Neither had Larkin. Neither had I. "How did you hurt your eye?" I asked. Kate pulled the little doll out from under the blanket and set it to one side. "I told you," she said. "He came to see me." "It was an accident," Larkin said. Kate snorted. "Which happened because your mother was in a rage." Larkin shrugged. "You're not wrong, but it was still an accident." He turned to me. "She made me do my chores when we got home last night." "In the dark," Kate muttered. "And I was angry too, and I split a log so hard that a piece of wood kicked back, caught me in the eye." He smiled ruefully. "Won't do that again." Kate flapped her hand impatiently. "But now it's done, so let's get on with things. Ellie, stir up the fire, will you, and heat your knife again." "But the honey's working." "Not for my leg," she said. "For his eye." Larkin nodded. "She means to let off some of the blood." He didn't seem too alarmed at the idea. Trust lay calm on his face. "And then a poultice," she said. "I brought a potato for that," Larkin said. Kate nodded. "Grate that into a bowl while Ellie heats the knife." She struggled to sit up. We both helped her, Captain coming close to supervise, until we had her perched on the edge of the bed, weaving a little with dizziness, hanging on to both of us, her head low. "Stars," she said. "Such a pretty warning." We held her steady until she could raise her head. Her bare feet, flat on the wood floor, were thin and white, woven through with blue veins, her toes tipped with yellow, thick nails. "Do you have socks?" I said. She pointed. "In that trunk there." I fetched a pair, happy to see other warm things inside the trunk, a pair of good boots nearby, waiting. I gave Larkin the socks. "Put these on her while I heat the knife." He looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. Kate watched us, smiling a little. "And I brought some stew." I nodded at the pack by the door. "It should be warm enough still." I held the blade of my knife in the flames and watched Larkin help her with the socks, watched him dish out some stew, watched her take a bite. "Oh my," she said, her eyes closed. "In all my life, in all the world, nothing has ever tasted better than this." "Do you want some?" I asked Larkin. "I'm not hungry," he said, though he looked like he was. He fetched a bowl and a grater from the cupboard, and in no time he had turned the potato into shreds. I liked a person who could do something well without a lot of wasted motions or time or wondering how to do it. He just did it. I said, "My father woke up this morning." Kate stopped eating, opened her eyes. "From a coma?" I nodded. "For how long was he gone?" I thought back. "Since late January, since just before that big storm." We had been housebound for days, sitting in the dark, cold cabin, watching my father sleep while the world outside wore white and blue and gold. "He was asleep for 12 weeks," I said. "Almost 13. And now he wakes, just like that." So I told them about the cold water and the snake and the potion I'd made, the twitching hand, the rolling eyes. They listened as if to a bedtime story. When I finished, Kate looked at me thoughtfully. "There was a time when I would have said coincidence, poppycock, wishful thinking, but that was a long time ago. Do you think it was something in the potion I fed him? Maybe the balsam?" She shook her head, went on eating. "Not in the least." "The snake?" She huffed. "Not that either." "Then what?" Larkin said. Kate shrugged, tipped her head toward the big books on the desk. "Something else that you won't find in those." And we'll pick up again next time.